Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the show. Today with us, we have Chris Butler. Chris has over 20 years of product management and business leadership experience at Microsoft, Waze, Kayak, and Facebook Reality Labs. He is now head of product operations, assistant vice president at Cognizant, where he PMs the PM experience. Chris can be connected. You can connect with Chris on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Medium. The links for connecting with him are below this video. Today, we'll be talking about one of his favorite topics, which is communal computing product management. With that, I'll turn off my video. Looking forward to learn from you, Chris. Thank you so much for being here. Excited to have you here. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you so much for the time today, and I'm really excited to talk about this. I prepared, just probably 5 or so minutes worth of slides, just because this is a newer concept, and so I want to make sure that people have the right background before we really jump in and start talking about the nitty-gritty and kind of what to do about it. And so this was something that over the last, couple years, I've done work at, Facebook Reality Labs on the Portal device, which is a video calling device and home assistant. I've built, Alexa skills. I've worked for a group called IPsoft that did conversational agents. And then even when I was at Philosophy, which is a design consultancy based out of New York and Los Angeles, I did a lot of work around kind of agents, devices, things like that. And I guess I realized that after a little while of building these things that they were really built wrong by design. And so they're framed wrong. There's something that we need to do a better job of actually I think not only framing the devices, but designing them and then building them for them to actually fit into the context that they are. And so, what do I mean when I say communal computing? I actually think about communal devices that would include things like the Amazon Alexa, the Google Home Hub, but there are also other things that exist within this context of the home, which is a very intimate space for all of us, like things like smart light bulbs. Even the Apple TV is a device that anybody inside of the home can use. And I think the most classic one is really this landline in your kitchen where anybody can pick up the phone, anybody can dial anywhere, anyone can receive a call. And then the way that you end up negotiating who is supposed to get that call is actually asking, who are you asking for? Who are you trying to talk to? And so there's lots of these devices in the home that are connected, and all of these are actually connected to some type of network, but there are lots of devices that are not connected at all, like lamps or refrigerators. And so anyways, I think just like when we start to look at these types of devices, they're very different than the personal phones that we have or the laptops, because those things are really built for us as individuals. And one of the things that starts to happen is, this is an example kind of made for Chris Butler playlist set. And what's really interesting is, because I have Spotify integrated with my Google Home Hub in the kitchen, there's something weird that starts to happen. And so you can see here that there's a bunch of different mixes. And in Daily Mix 6 is actually something that I don't listen to personally very much. But for some reason, it's now turned into a playlist for me. And the reason why is actually because my kids, they know how to use the Google Home Hub. They know how to ask for music. And so they're playing music all the time in the kitchen that is not necessarily my music, but because of the way that Spotify thinks about the behavioral data that's coming out of the Google Home Hub, they end up just integrating it with my profile. And so that then skews my recommendations. Another place that this will happen is in Netflix, before they had profiles. If you ever had someone come over that was a guest or maybe a babysitter or something like that, if they ever used the Netflix, you would end up skewing all of your recommendations based on the things that they were watching. And so now they do have a multiple profile setup, but they don't really think about the idea of guests, right? And so they still have to choose some random profile to be able to watch something. And so these are the problems that start to come up in communal computing devices. And that's something I want to talk about. And then most recently, actually, this was yesterday, there was a great tweet by Dan Hahn about this fridge that started emailing him. And so, he probably set up this account a while ago with his email address. It got provisioned. I mean, you could ask the question like, why do you need a smart freezer or a refrigerator in the first place? But he started suddenly getting emails about the number of times the door was opening on average. And it's an amazing Twitter thread that I can post to the chat later, but just about like all the kind of things that it's starting to do, like around badging and gamification to try to get them to not open the door as much. But he also has kids. And so, how much of this is actually advice for him versus the household as a whole? And how does this kind of feel like almost like harassment or nagging from a device that's actually in his house when it should be maybe something that is working with the environment itself? So I think it's like a really interesting, very present kind of part of this. So why are they built wrong? And I think this really comes down to the history of computing, which is this idea of a single user context. And so this is something that started back in the 1960s or 70s. At first, mainframes that were built as kind of general computing devices, they were as big as a room. People had to walk up to them. They had to put in their cards, the punch cards that they had just created to run a program. There was some physicality in the way that those devices were actually used. But as we started to allow for a server and client architecture, where there was a server somewhere in the depths of a building, and then there was a client that was sitting on a desk somewhere, many different people could start utilizing the computing resources at the same time. And so we needed to now start to, one, split the capability of that computer. We didn't want one person just using all of the resources, but also we needed to start to be able to understand who was doing what processes. And so this is where the single user context came out of. And it started basically from an academic and a research standpoint. The single user context then got moved into all types of computing, especially when we talk about the home PC, and then eventually the personal phone, with the the iPhone really starting to take over that market, really kind of reinforced this idea of a personal phone, a personal kind of device, one that has my login, one that is built for me and specifically. Then the Amazon Echo comes along and reintroduces this idea of kind of general computing platforms, mostly through a voice interface, back into the home. And so you get all these like really odd issues that start to crop up because of the fact that you've now taken something that is an Amazon Echo that is set up by one person, right? It is attached to my Amazon account. And now anybody in my household, which is not only say my partner or my kids, but also guests, people that are coming in to do things like maintenance, like handymen, people like that, right? So there's all these different people that are coming through the house that have varying levels of trust that is almost like in violation to this idea of the single user context. And so, what types of problems arise? And I have a whole article on O'Reilly about a 3-article series, but there's one article in particular that kind of lays out all the different problems, but it comes down to really 5 key things. And so one of them is around identity. Right, we not only have our identity versus the other people that are in our home, but there are also very many different pseudo identities that exist. So I'm not only a person that is like a father and someone that is part of this household, but I also have a job. I'm part of a friend group from high school. I'm part of a friend group from college. I'm part of a friend group of parents that are near here. And so all those different identities actually, plus the identities of all the other people in the household, like my children and how they're at school, or my children and their play dates, those are all different identities that are being mashed into one device and causing many problems because of that. Second thing is privacy, is that because of all these different identities, and then as well as norms that we have in the household, which norm is really just kind of an expectation for the way things work. I really think this idea of kind of contextual integrity around privacy is that we're trying to not just like segment information as public or private, but we're trying to control the flow of that information. So in some cases, having a picture show up on my device in my home could be very different than a picture showing up on my personal phone versus a picture showing up on a picture frame in an office somewhere. And then security is really interesting because we need to now take this trade-off that if we don't know for sure who's in the room, and there could be multiple people, and we don't know what the flow of the information is that's supposed to be there, we may actually have to create additional or alternative security methods to be able to understand whether this is the right thing to do or not. And so there's a lot of work that's going into things like biometric recognition, like facial recognition, voice recognition. So Amazon Echo has things like voice profiles. Google Home Hub has things like voice match and face match. But I still don't think it's quite right because we're still talking about this idea that you're either logged in or you're not. Next thing is experience. So The fact that Netflix has a bunch of different profiles that you can only be one at the same time, when the reality is you actually have multiple people that could be sitting on the couch watching something. And I think Spotify started to go down this path a little bit with their Duo and Premium Family accounts, where they actually have a central playlist that for everybody that's on that account, so you have one billing relationship, but you have multiple accounts on Spotify. For everybody that has an account within that billing relationship, they start to have a shared playlist. So it's everything that everybody would like. And I think that's like a really interesting part of that experience. And then finally, this idea of ownership. So once you start to deploy things in your home, the expectation of what happens to that data, what happens to that device long-term, is very different, because we expect to be able to buy something like a refrigerator, put it in our home, and maybe even sell it to someone else. And so this idea of, I have actually a subscription billing relationship to be able to use something, right? If I have to transfer that to someone else, what does that mean? And so there's lots and lots of problems that start showing up with ownership, not just about data, but about the device itself. And also when we talk about end of life of a device, ownership becomes a big problem. Like if a startup ships a device and then suddenly changes the way that they want to do things, should I be allowed to opt out of that because I've integrated with my home in some way? And so I think that a really interesting way to think about this is, and it may be a way out, is that we no longer think of people as just individuals using a device. This is my Amazon Echo, but this is actually the home's Amazon Echo. And then we think about it as more of an ecosystem within the home, where there's many different people, devices, relationships, services that are existing. And so this is an example of maybe an ecosystem within my home where I have, a bunch of different things like an Echo, I have a digital picture frame, and there's services and devices that are intermediating essentially people here, which are the, mom, me, my partner, and my child, and my child's friend, right? And so what we should be really thinking about is, how do we fit within this new ecosystem, rather than just the idea of we're going to just build a service and one person's going to use it. So that's all I wanted to share today before we have a conversation. But I think this helps outline kind of the problem that we're having when it comes to communal computing in general. And so, yeah, thank you so much for listening. I think I went over 5 minutes, but yeah, I think it's important context to be able to have this conversation about now how do we do product management for these things is really, really hard.
Yeah, this is such a solid groundwork. Thank you for setting the right groundwork and context for this conversation. Curious about, you've written extensively on this topic. I've read your articles on O'Reilly about the new nature of polysocial reality and how to go about.
Oh, well, yeah, that's not mine either, by the way. That's Dr. Sally Aplin, and she's done a lot of amazing work, way more work than I have, by the way, from an academic sense, into this idea of kind of how, in that network, how messages work. So I just want to make sure that's clear. But yeah, the polysocial reality thing is a really interesting aspect of this. But focus on
what is that?
Yeah,
just for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a huge body of work that Dr. Aplin has done around this, along with one of her co-authors, and so it's really about this idea. There's a couple different things that come into polysocial reality, and I definitely want to, I would say go read her work, because it's going to be much more comprehensive. But there's two things that kind of come out of it, and so one of them is this idea of when we talk about all the different devices and people, there's actually a lot of interaction that are taking place that once you have synchronous and asynchronous messages that are being passed around, there are going to be some cases where the person that is supposed to get a message is being queued on a device, and then that device actually makes decisions about what it should do with those queued messages. And so everything that's being built in this environment actually, has some kind of repercussions in an end order way to the entire system itself. And then secondarily, there's this idea of kind of thing theory, which is the idea of how do we start to build kind of agents within this system. And so I think what's interesting about the work there is, this idea of kind of thing from the Addams family, which was like just a hand that walked around, but it was really meant to be kind of an autonomous agent that helped anybody in the household, and was available in every room. I think some of the things where I think I'm not exactly sure that we always want to have agents that are at that level within our household. So I've been actually pulling from, a slightly different group of things around like animistic design, which is something that came from a Professor Philip out of Art Center College of Design. And this is the idea that, animism is actually a concept that comes from the idea that every both animate and inanimate object has a spirit. But I think the way that we're trying to interpret this is the idea that every object that's in our home, we have expectations about the way that it should work, and that it may have actual personality traits or moods or things like that in the way that we want to interact with it. And so I guess the best example of this is that when we talk about like voice enablement of everything in the home, you probably don't actually expect everything in your home to respond to you with a voice, right? So like the lamp that I have sitting next to me right here, I may want to be able to control it via voice. I may want to be able to like just point at it and say turn on, or walk into this room and just say turn on the lights, right? And not have to worry about, you know, in the case of say like smart home stuff today, it's like I want to turn on the basement lights, right? So I shouldn't have to do that, because we end up getting this like really a lot of problems about like guests that are trying to walk in and they have to read this huge sheet of like what is every zone called, what is every light called. But I should be able to maybe just like ask a lamp to turn itself on. But I don't necessarily expect it to say, yes, you know, I've just been turned on, right? Like, I think it's something that maybe it just turns on, right? And so this idea of like, I don't expect a lamp to actually have a conversation with me, I think is another important concept, is that we don't want to always have these high agentive type of devices in the home, because there are things that we have for very simple uses, like a lamp, that we want to be different than this idea of kind of an all-inclusive agent. And so, you know, Christopher Nocell has also done a lot of work around like agentive technology, things like that. And so, anyways, a bunch of different inspirations into how to think about this in some way. And it's definitely been something that you know, I've been kind of like thinking about. One of the questions I get from a lot of people is like, so if Amazon and Google are not doing anything about this right now with regards to the way that identity models work, how do I actually build a skill that's correct or an app for one of these things? And I think one of the most key things is just around behavioral data, right? Not assuming that anything that happens in my Google Home Hub is going to be the same person or set of people that is happening on my personal mobile phone when I listen to music, right? And so that simple split starts to put us into this realm of like, okay, well, so suddenly there's like a completely different genre of music being played on my Google Home Hub up in the kitchen. That probably doesn't mean I just discovered a new set of music, right? Like our music tastes don't actually change, I think, past high school is really, or teenager years is what I think there was a recent study that was done around it. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's so cool to know. So this is very interesting topic. We'll get into more product management stuff now. So
yeah.
I'm curious about what led you to this path. Obviously, you have worked in areas that has given you the exposure to the problem, right? What led you to the path of identifying this as a real problem, which it is, and then how did you break into the product management aspects of this problem, right? So if you can share some of that. The reason I'm asking this question is for someone who is a product manager, if they want to understand how they break into the space like you did, what is a path that they can model, right? Model successful people. So I'm just creating this pathway for others if they want to follow along, right? So
yeah, and I mean, I think like one warning I always like to give about this is that everybody has a different path in this world, and so, you know, just because things worked for me, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's the right path or it's one that will work for everybody, right? Like I come from a place of privilege. Like I definitely have gotten a lot of benefits out of this world to be able to do the things I do. And I've also been incredibly lucky, right? Like I think that's the other thing. But what I would say is that the reason why I've been drawn to this work around communal computing most recently, and if you look at my career, I've always been really interested in kind of what are a set of problems in the way that a new technology needs to fit with a larger way that people end up interfacing with technology. And so, you know, early on, I was really interested, like I think probably the first couple cases where this really became true was not even when I was like working in Microsoft. But Microsoft, we did a lot of really interesting things where it's kind of like there were a lot of weird transition periods. So like I was at Hotmail when Gmail came out. And so what do we need to do now to actually adapt to this new world? And the idea of kind of like unlimited storage was like a really interesting question, and ended up being something that I had like a lot of direct purview over because of the fact I was handling a lot of data warehousing, customer support tools, other types of backend tools for the way that just Hotmail managed its humongous infrastructure for the time. But then when we start to look at the trajectory of where Gmail was going to take storage, it meant that we had to like change the way we thought about everything, right? Both from an operations standpoint, but from like a way that we interact with users. I'd say after that, you know, I ended up working at a company called Dash Navigation, which doesn't exist anymore. It was bought by RIM a long time ago, but was really like the proto Waze, but it was a physical device. And so what happens when you start to integrate like actual two-way internet services into the car is a really interesting question, and how you do it in a way that's not going to be kind of hazardous to people's health. Ended up doing my own restaurant startup. How do we start to apply things like business intelligence, data analysis to the way that we actually end up booking restaurants, right? And so it's always this kind of intersection between some type of new technology trend, some new way of doing things, and then looking at how that actually impacts the way people will interface with things that are common for them. And most recently, just kind of thinking a lot about the way that I interact with devices in my home. This communal computing thing just kept on kind of nagging at me as I was building things and working on them. So I would say that there's lots of different types of people in this world. There's lots of different types of product managers. The type of product manager I am tends to be very novelty focused, right? I'm always looking across a lot of different fields to try to understand what's going on there. And so I've done work in VR. I've done work on kind of the intersection of machine learning and technology. I've been starting to dabble in some stuff around kind of blockchain, but more from the standpoint of like peer-to-peer networks with Urbit. And so there's just like, I think I look at a lot of different things, and not all of them turn into something that's actually valuable, right? Like the idea of VR applications in industrial settings is still not there yet, right? Like there's maybe something about training, there's definitely something about gaming, but is there something about like the way that all of us as individuals like socialize, right? In the way that say Facebook is going after Horizon and things like that, it's still out, right? Like we don't know. And then Urbit, which is like this peer-to-peer networking, like creating your own internet, right? That's even further out. It's like, how do we understand like what would be the right way for us to network with individuals if we didn't have the different bigger like corporations that we have today that are kind of owning the networking. So I'd say like novelty focus has always been something for me, and that's the reason why I've always gone off this. But I think there's a lot of product managers that are out there too that are really great at what they do, but their job is more about optimization or more about the idea. And I use Kent Beck's 3X model, which is on the S curve of like explore, expand, and exploit. I use that model a lot because I tend to think of myself in that explore area. The moment that we start getting into the like exploit or extract like optimization stuff, I'm kind of like, there's someone else that's way better at this than me. They're way more organized than me at that. And so like I think that's kind of how I've come to this conclusion about just the things I'm really passionate about.
That finally explains the title of your LinkedIn profile. It says chaotic product manager or something along those lines.
Chaotic good, yeah, chaotic good product manager. I mean, it's definitely a hat tip to like Dungeons and Dragons, which is something I played when I was a kid, and something that actually my kids are starting to get into. They're still just a little too young to like get into real Dungeons and Dragons, but I think that the thing for me, what it means, and this is maybe linked back to some work I did around like what I'd call adversarial product management, but it's this idea of that. There's a lot of bias or assumptions that we start creating for ourselves, and our organizations do this as well. There's a lot of great work by Rich Bettis, around this idea of like dominant logic, which is essentially, once people become successful, they start using their old mental models and the way they did things to do things in the future. And the problem with that is that it may work in some cases, but because the future is constantly changing the way the world works, your old assumptions may not work anymore. And so I think the reason why chaotic is part of this is that I do think that injecting more randomness into the processes that we do. And so like I have examples of like using card decks as like ideation processes. Using randomness actually helps break down the biases and assumptions that we hold dear, because the randomness just doesn't care, right? Like it's going to do what is randomness. And then it's up to us as human beings to then react to that randomness in some way. And so I think this is really valuable when we're trying to figure out something new. Well, usually the idea of innovation, right? Like whenever, the role I have today around product operations, we have to do a lot around how do we do performance evaluation is a thing we're doing right now. But one of the key questions that keeps coming up is like, what is an innovation competency within a product manager? And I would argue that innovation is really about the idea of reframing the way that something works. And so it's not just the idea of, say, applying something in some new way, and it's just this like magical creative process, but it's the idea about like looking at the way that the world works today, taking a different viewpoint, and then building something that fits that new viewpoint. And randomness is interesting because it can help you look at a lot of different viewpoints or a lot of different framings without you getting stuck in this idea that, like the blind spot bias is the most insidious bias. And the reason why is because you don't know that you're being biased, right? Like you cannot actually see your own biases most of the time. And so that's kind of where the chaotic good comes from. The good part means that I'm just always trying to help people as well. And that's my key goal, is to help people in general. And like humanity in general, I guess we want to go to like the extreme, but that's why I think this chaos is also good, because, you know, even if the universe is in some way kind of, you know, there is a chain of events that lead to something, because we're human beings, we have no idea what that is, right? And we see things as random. So anyways, that's kind of the reason why that's an approach that I've applied to my product management practice that I've found to be very valuable, especially when we're trying to think of new things.
Yeah,
That's
innovation. Yeah, so true about your point of innovation. On For someone who wants to break into, switching gears a little bit, you shared some of your behavioral attributes, which are amazing. Thanks for sharing that. Like, now, if you know, home assistants are and smart displays are going to be around for many years, right? They're just getting started. We haven't even fully figured out how to integrate them in our day-to-day life. My question for you is, someone wants to, you know, someone who is a fresh off product manager. Now she wants to learn about this space. She wants to get into this space. She wants to make an impact. What are the skill sets? What are the attributes that, what are the habits that we should pursue to achieve, to, you know, to get to this space? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I list out some kind of do's and don'ts around communal computing, and I think what it backs into when it comes to the skills for product managers. I think one of the things that has been most valuable to me, and I didn't really learn this until much, like I would say in the last half of my career so far, is really around great user research and partnering with great user researchers and social scientists and people that are able to understand and really investigate the way that people think and do things in this world. And so probably the first place that really came, you know, I didn't call it this at the time, but when I was doing the restaurant startup, every Friday I would go to one of our client restaurants and I would stage, which means to just basically like volunteer to be another host on that Friday night. And so, you know, my main interest was understanding how people were using the technology that we had built, but also to understand the context around them, right? And so this is called like contextual inquiry. It's maybe more interactive than contextual inquiry, because I was actually wiping down menus, seating people, helping with like other issues that were coming up with the system. But that really taught me that it wasn't just about our technology, but it was about how our technology fit into the restaurant ecosystem, how it impacted not only the front of house, like the hosts and the waiters and waitresses, but this idea of like people that were at the bar, people that were in the kitchen, the bussers, the managers, all these different people that were interacting, they had a different thing that we could do to help them. And so a good example of that was the way that, you know, the host had kind of the highest and quickest job, but usually were the lowest experienced in the restaurant. And so how do we make the interface so it's very simple for them? How do we reduce a lot of the cognitive load around even communication? So they're getting lots of calls, they're getting emails, they're getting all these things. So how do we figure that out? But then for managers and for the back of house staff, they want to know kind of when is the peak of the service going to be? And so how do we help prepare them for that in some way? This really didn't, I think, like get locked into place until I was at Philosophy, where it's as a design consultancy, you know, worked with amazing designers and researchers. And what was interesting is that product managers were expected to be very involved in the research that we did. And so I had to become very good at not only kind of the nuts and bolts like recruiting and writing interview guides, but also interviewing and learning how to do that in a way that is very unbiased. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that product managers make is that when they're asking someone about their project, they ask about the project itself and do you want this, yes or no? When the reality is you want to take a step back and you want to really understand kind of how does this person think about things? How do they feel about things? What are the ways that they actually integrate this with their life, right? That really gives you way more information about how to move forward with something than just saying, do you want this or not? Right. And this is maybe where I think we need to always have a balance between quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data will give you the understanding of what is the behavior that's taking place once you've shipped something. Qualitative behavior tells you why. It may even tell you a little bit about why in the future something would be valuable or beneficial. And so I think like for communal computing, right, one of the key things here is that working with great people that are social scientists, anthropologists, ergonomic specialists, right? All those people start to think about the positioning of these devices in the home or in the office. And I think that's really, really valuable. So I'd say like either learning, learning what is good research, and two, partnering really well with these people that do this type of research is a really, really important aspect for the future of how we understand these things, because it's no longer going to be about the idea that we're just shipping a device for one person, right? We're actually shipping a device that's going to be part of an ecosystem, and that it's not that there's a gap in that ecosystem. Like maybe they're buying your device because they wanted to like play music or something like that, but there's not a hole that needs to be filled. You need to in some way figure out how it gets situated into this ecosystem and then lasts for a while, because like if it doesn't meet the needs, right, there's only so many power plugs in your house. Someone's going to unplug it and replace it with something else, right? And so having that understanding and intimate knowledge of really why do people want this here, how does it fit, how does everybody use it, I think is a really, really important aspect of that.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is user research and the design challenges are some of the primary areas of growth for the next few months or few years in this area, in this home assistance and smart devices area. And as opposed
to, I think so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So as opposed to platform product management or AI product management, where some of the design challenges have already been identified and solved for, and this one we are still in that early phases of trying to figure out what we don't even know, right? So is that how you would summarize it? This is still very much of a design problem.
I think it's definitely a design problem. I would just say that when we talk about AI, we have to ask, like, what do we really mean, right? Because I've done a lot of work where I was at a design consultancy as the head of AI projects. So my role was basically to like fake things about fake things. And so, AI is not this all-encompassing, like, agent that is super intelligent. It's a model that has been trained on a bunch of data. That probably has, well, not probably, definitely has some type of human bias in it. And so, but it's still not necessarily legible or understandable or explainable to people. And so these things still require, how does the human being actually understand what's going on, right? And so I think that's where things like voice assistants, right? Like there's a bunch of different types of AI that go into that. So it's like speech to text. There's this idea of now taking that text and understanding what the request is. And then it's in some way figuring out what to do, right? And then responding. And so there's like text to speech and things like that. And so those are actually all different models that are being kind of chained together to be able to achieve a need. The things that are interesting is that we still, I think we've done a lot of great work when it comes to the way people want to interact with voice. But when we talk about communal computing, and again, maybe it's because we're trying to now like broaden our understandings that it's not just a single person talking to something, right? But it's that two people could be talking to something at the same time. And Amazon has done a little bit of work about allowing for this like multiple party conversation. Well, no, I mean, a lot of people have done work around this, by the way, but Amazon has like finally started to release things where you can have skills where it's multiple people talking to something and understanding, right? There's many different modes that can take place when it comes to just interaction with these like voice assistants. It could be a single person. It could be multiple people in a cooperative way. So it could be that like we're both my spouse and I are sitting on the couch and we're asking questions about what to watch. That could be cooperative in some way. We want to build on top of all of our questions to get to a list of things that we want to watch. But it could also be in some way adversarial or competitive. So like between me and my son yelling at like a device to play a certain music or not, right, is kind of adversarial. And the norms that are now dictated are actually human norms where it's up to me to decide what is the appropriate action. Do I relent, or do I, try to punish or correct or something like that, right? And so there's a bunch of different things that come into these interactions, and I think that we're still not there, right? I would say that even for AI or machine learning models, like there's so much to do when it comes to how people build the understanding and like interpretation of what this machine is meaning to do. Now, there's limits to this, right? Because there's always going to be times where you just won't you won't know what this non-deterministic system is going to do. And so the question is like, how do we build the right expectations? And so I would just argue that this is like this is the problem for everything for forever, is like constantly how human beings are going to interact with technology. So I would say that there's never a time that this is ever going to be not needed, right? When it comes to that. But I mean, yeah, we're much better. I mean, I think we've gotten down kind of like, we understand much more about the way that like our thumbs work on a mobile phone, right? Like we understand the kind of affordances that are necessary there, right? As we start to pull stuff more back into automation or things like that, that's when it starts changing again, is like, what do we need to display in this case? So yeah.
Wonderful. Hey, I have unmuted most of the people who want to speak or ask a live question. So feel free to raise your hand and ask your question. So this is your chance to interact directly with Chris. And this is your chance to ask him a question if you have any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can put it in chat. My next question is around what are some of the stakeholder management skills when it comes to this role, right? Do you think you have managed design stakeholders a lot closely, or is it across the board? If you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, stakeholder management is really interesting. I mean, I think we have to first define what is stakeholder in this case, and I would argue that stakeholder is usually anybody that has the ability to like alter or cancel your project or product. And I think what's really interesting here is it's really more about power dynamics inside of the organization than it is about, I think there's a real value for having people that have lots of experience inside of an organization as like basically subject matter experts, right, as a type of stakeholder. I think there's a real issue in a lot of modern corporate environments, though, where it's like everybody gets to put in their 2 cents. And I've kind of joked that like when everybody puts in their 2 cents, the world goes blind. And the reason why is that when you're in position of power, this idea of your 2 cents is no longer just 2 cents. And I think Derek Silvers talks about this, where it's like, when you're in a position of leadership, I think actually 2 cents are really hazardous because people see that as a command. And so anyways, I think like this is a roundabout way of just saying that when we talk about how we do stakeholder management, it's really trying to understand what are their motivations as well. So I think a lot of the things that come from, like client management in the consulting world, stakeholder management in the PM world, this idea of even user research, understanding the reason why people have the motivations they do, that can be really valuable. And so getting to know people, and when we talk about stakeholder management, it comes down a lot to trust, right? Generally, if a person trusts you or if that stakeholder trusts you, it becomes much easier to get things done or to have them give you the benefit of the doubt. The issue is like, how do you build trust with that particular stakeholder can be different depending on the stakeholder, right? Like I've almost joked that, there's some great guidelines that I've seen about kind of low technology understanding people. And when I read all of them, people that are not able to like use technology as like fluently as maybe other people are. And when I read a lot of that, like people, they just don't have a lot of time. They don't really have a lot of context. They don't understand. When we think about it, like a lot of people in management are basically that. So one of the things that I've found that is way more effective, in addition to building trust, but it's the idea of that you need to actually simplify your messaging to stakeholders an awful lot. They may say they want to dig into the details around things, but honestly, when you get into the details, they don't have the context to fully understand those details. So it becomes more of a question like, how do you get them to give you the context they have, and how do you provide the context to them that they need to have so that you can come to a good agreement about things, right? Like every time that I hear a PM say, how do I convince my manager that this is the right thing to do? I ask, well, have you understood why they disagree with you in the first place, right? Like that is actually way more interesting and important than you just like shoving this down their throat. Like you want to understand what is the context they have, which is usually more broad,
right,
so that you can make better decisions that are in line with them.
Right. Wonderful. Well, I have my last question for you, and then we'll take any more questions from the audience if they have. Feel free to raise your hand anytime now. My next question, and this is the last question, we've taken more time than we committed to, so thank you for staying over.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no I really appreciate that. I value and respect your time, so thank you. My next question is, we started this whole conversation at 7 a.m., right? And it takes a lot of energy management to do what you do. What are some of the techniques or habits that has worked for you to become a successful, chaotic manager like you are? Like exploration, innovation takes so much energy, right? So how do you manage that part of your life?
I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, one, a lot of coffee. So stimulants don't hurt when it comes to this. But I think I've started to realize through my career that the things that I'm really passionate about are the things that I'm probably good at as well. And so I think, like Facebook would call this your strengths. Um, and I've also realized what I'm not good at or things that I dislike doing. And so I think doing everything you can to maximize the things that are within your strengths and minimize the things that are not, I think is actually really important to the energy overall, right? Like the times that I end up feeling the worst or having the lowest energy are really when I'm doing something that just doesn't feel great, right? And I think that sounds, I mean, now that I say it, it seems very obvious, but I think just everything that you can do to try to minimize and like the things that are not like great or things that you don't find passion around. And I think this goes into time management as well, right? Like I actually try to block off my whole Wednesday. I do usually East Coast hours just because a lot of my team is out there, but I will block my calendar very aggressively to make time for the things I need to do. And that's because I think PMs are this weird balance between reactive and proactive work. And the problem is that if you book all of your time with meetings, you're never going to get to the actual work, right? I mean, it is part of the work in the sense that you're communicating, you're building teams, you're doing all these things that are really important around alignment. But because the world is so uncertain, you need to be able to not only be reactive to new things that come in, and so you need the space to be able to do that and the mental space, but also you need to be able to then focus on these like proactive things that are more future looking. And so I think that's like another thing that I would just argue is that really trying to, and again, you don't always have the ability. Every job or role is about a trade-off. And so sometimes you'll have more negative trade-off than positive trade-off. And so that's when you should go and look for another job. I don't mean quit your job or anything like that and just go like find another one. But I mean, you should be trying to make adjustments within your own experience. But then if things are not working out, you should always be looking for something else too. And so I think that's like the main thing for me. I mean, I would also just argue that something that I've learned through facilitation skills and kind of the idea of being a consultant is that, also just kind of faking your excitement about something, even if you're not super excited about it, it can help a little bit, right? So there have been times over the last couple of weeks where I've had to do like 2 or 3 workshops over the course of a day. And facilitation is an incredibly draining activity because you have to be attuned with the group. And it's even harder now that we're in remote kind of settings. But it's super exhausting. And so I think just like over time, just putting a little bit more like effort into like getting the effect out of the world that you want, like the way that you do this, I think is something I've found to be helpful too. It is very hard though sometimes. Like there are times I'm exhausted to be able to do things. So also sleep schedule is very important, and then like getting some physical exercise. So those are things that I like add on top of that. But after the coffee, the time savings, the balancing the good and bad things, and then finally sleep and like working out.
Thank you for sharing that. We'll conclude the presentation now. I really appreciate you making time for us, Chris. This is the part of my life that's my favorite part. I get to talk to the experts like you, learn from them, get a personal lesson, and share it with the community of over 10,000 product managers that we have. So you will be seeing this video on our YouTube channel. I'll tag you in there as well. And thank you so much. I appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd love to connect with anybody over LinkedIn as well if they want to. I'm really excited about talking about this topic, so I'd love to see it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.